Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this panel on pluralism, human rights, and stability in Central Asia. This topic gets to the heart of the purpose of the OSCE and the obligations which come along with being an OSCE participating state. We have an excellent panel of experts who will share insights from their research, documentation, and advocacy. But first I want to set the stage for our event and our discussion today. The concept of pluralism is quite expansive, but essentially it means an environment where people with various perspectives, ideas, and identities exist and are able to realize their desires, passions, and beliefs on equal footing and in a dignified way. While this conference and panel examine the human dimension, it is important to recognize the interconnectedness between all of the dimensions and how they contribute to human security. In other words, pluralism is inextricably connected and contributes to economic progress and development as well as stability and security. The OSCE and its participating states recognize many aspects of pluralism, including political pluralism, media pluralism, and pluralism in governance, and how these are necessary for the fulfillment of OSCE human rights and democracy obligations. If we consider elections, the ODIHR election observation reports for recent elections in Central Asia identify numerous challenges to pluralism, such as the absence of a diversity of parties and slanted coverage by pro-state media. These features quite understandably make it difficult for people to run for office and to vote for their chosen representatives, undermining the elections and their results. Many other human rights commitments are also closely linked with pluralism: the freedoms of expression, association, and assembly, to name a few. If people cannot express themselves in the manner they desire, or if certain topics are off limits for public discussion, this necessarily excludes certain people and views from the public discourse and deals a blow to pluralism. The same goes for organizing public gatherings or civil society organizations around issues of personal and community interest. Without these rights, how can we possibly expect to establish a pluralistic society and government? Now I'd like to introduce the panel. My name is Matthew Schaaf. I'm Advocacy Director with Freedom Now, but I'm just the moderator. First we'll have Lucie Tafforin from International Partnership for Human Rights, who will share the results of human rights documentation and monitoring work in Central Asia. Followed by Alisher Ilkhamov from Central Asia Due Diligence, and Serik Beyssembayev from PaperLab Research Center. Alisher and Serik will share a more sociological and analytical perspective on pluralism and stability in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. While most of the information shared today will be about the professed reformers of Central Asia, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, we understand, of course, that this is an issue in many other countries in the region, and we welcome questions and contributions from individuals about other countries and from their own experience. So thank you for coming, and look forward to an interesting discussion. And Lucie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm speaking today on behalf of International Partnership for Human Rights, IPHR. We are a Brussels and Tbilisi-based NGO which aims to empower civil society groups who are working to advance the protection of human rights in the former Soviet Union. IPHR and its partners have been conducting joint monitoring in Central Asia with partners for over 15 years now, and we regularly feed our concerns into various advocacy initiatives. Thank you, Freedom Now, for the invitation to this important roundtable and for the opportunity to outline the importance of human rights in this triangle: democracy, pluralism, and human rights, and to give a very quick overview of the current human rights challenges in Central Asia. IPHR strongly believes that democracy, pluralism, and human rights are interconnected and mutually reinforcing. All Central Asian states are signatories to the most important human rights treaties and thus have taken upon themselves human rights obligations to respect and protect the human rights of individuals within their jurisdiction as enshrined in international and domestic law. As was mentioned, limitations on fundamental freedoms have grown alarmingly in Central Asia in recent years, particularly against the backdrop of protests in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, to which the governments responded to with excessive use of force and violence. The state responses to the January 2022 protests in Kazakhstan, protests in the Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Region, Gabao in Tajikistan, and in the Republic of Karakapalstan in Uzbekistan have resulted in 2022 being the bloodiest year in the decade in the Central Asia region. with at least 300 civilian deaths and credible reports of the widespread use of torture and ill treatment against detained protesters. The impact of these events on fundamental freedoms in these countries have been dramatic, with increasing limitations, intimidation, harassment, and politically motivated persecution against human rights defenders, activists, journalists, and bloggers who speak out against government policies and for the right of citizens across the region. As you know, in January 2022, protests in the west of Kazakhstan against the increase of gas prices quickly triggered huge political protests as thousands took to the streets across the country to demand social and political change. Taken aback by the large-scale protests, the Kazakhstani authorities used force to crack down on the unrest with the intervention of Russian CSTO military forces. The authorities used excessive force, and this led to the death of at least 238 people, protesters and passerbys. The arbitrary detentions of thousands of protesters and the widespread torture and ill treatment in detention. In November 2021 and again in May 2022, the Tajikistani authorities responded with violence to mass protests in the Gabao region, which were sparked by tensions between the central government and the autonomous oblast. Reported violations by the state include the excessive use of force, extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detentions, torture and ill treatment, and dozens or even hundreds of people serving lengthy prison sentences after unfair trials where they were found guilty under broadly worded, ambiguous criminal articles for allegedly being involved in extremist or terrorist groups and for inciting hatred. In July 2022, mass protests broke out in the Republic of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan against proposed constitutional amendments which would have deprived the Republic of its current constitutionally protected status and its right to secede from Uzbekistan. Yet again, there are credible reports that authorities use excessive force, arbitrary detentions, and torture and ill treatment when putting down these protests. According to official figures, at least 21 people died and over 270 needed medical assistance. However, the real figures are reported to be much higher. In all three of these countries, there has been no accountability for the serious human rights violations that were perpetrated by security forces in these crises. The governments have failed to thoroughly, effectively, and objectively investigate allegations of excessive use of force, torture and ill treatment, and other violations of the rights of protesters during these events. And they have failed to bring those responsible to justice. This has resulted in widespread impunity for serious human rights abuse. We call on the international community not to stand by silently, but insist that human rights are respected and demand effective international independent investigations into the events in the Gabao, Kazakhstan, and the Bloody January events in Kazakhstan. Against the backdrop of these events, a number of worrying trends continue to plague civic space across Central Asia. Persecution of civil society activists, opposition supporters, human rights defenders, journalists and bloggers who speak out against injustice, criticize government policies and demand transparency and accountability of those in power have grown since these events. The use of criminal prosecution as a tool to intimidate and silence critical voices is of particular concern. It is a tactic that was used during the crackdowns against these mass protests, but is also more broadly used in all countries of the region where criminal cases on slander, extortion, extremism, mass riots, and other charges are initiated in retaliation against those who exercise their fundamental freedoms of expression, association, and assembly in peaceful and legitimate ways. The pressure on independent media and restrictions on access to alternative information through the internet has also intensified in recent years. The few independent media outlets that operate in the region are subjected to ongoing intimidation and harassment, both online and offline. Several recent government initiatives have aimed to shut down independent media services and block access to their sites in Tajikistan. And this has also been observed in Kyrgyzstan, where the media environment had until recently been more favorable than elsewhere in the region. As state control over media operation increases, Central Asian authorities are misusing the fight against disinformation to stifle free speech across the region. In regards to freedom of association, excessive and unjustified restrictions on the operations of independent civil society organizations are seen across all Central Asian countries. In Tajikistan particularly, over 700 NGOs have been shut down or forced to self-liquidate in the past 2 years. That's an incredibly high number. Draft legislation mirroring Russia-style anti-NGO laws governing the operation of NGOs continue to threaten the hard-won gains in terms of civil society participation in all Central Asian countries. In particular, foreign-funded NGOs risk being subjected to stigmatization and excessive state regulation and interference. Finally, freedom of assembly is also restricted, as practices undermining the right to peaceful protests are seen across all countries. As Matthew said in his introduction regarding OSCE obligations, in relation to these events in these three countries, as well as other events in Central Asia, there's a clear burden of responsibility for the international community. In their engagement with Central Asia, international actors have a vital role to play in speaking out on human rights issues and cases and pushing for concrete steps for the governments of the region to roll back repressive policies which undermine public debate and civic participation. Despite the new geopolitical reality since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, all international actors must react publicly and in a timely manner to human rights violations, both in order to urge the Central Asian governments to hold accountable those who commit human rights violations, but also to support victims of abuse, civil society, and to prevent the further erosion of fundamental freedoms that we're currently observing in Central Asia. Ahead of this conference, IPHR, together with partners in Central Asia, published a regional briefing, which I've displayed here, on our key concerns regarding fundamental freedoms in the region. We invite you to read it for more information on the developments I mentioned in this presentation. It also highlights specific cases which are of concern to us. So please serve yourself to these papers. They're both in Russian and in English. And if there's any questions at the end, it will be very interesting. There'll be an interesting conversation. Thank you very much for your attention.
I would ask to I'm going to kind of provide more details on Uzbekistan. I'm originally from this country, so for the moment I'm reside in the United Kingdom. I'm still following the situation, trying to do research, analyze the situation, and to time to publish on the different aspects of developments in Uzbekistan. So everything could be understood probably through comparison, so that's why to understand the status of affairs for the moment in Uzbekistan, we should probably compare the previous regime of Ilkhamov. He died, passed away in 2016, and he ruled almost 30 years, and only his death actually ended his kind of rule, which is quite characteristic for this kind of regimes. It's one could also expect same with the current regime, but still, the previous regime was probably one of the most repressive in the world. With probably you heard about the tragedy in Alisher, when kind of hundreds of people were killed, shot by the military. Every cotton harvest season, the country was turned into labor camp. There was almost no any kind of freedom of press, expression, not to say about freedom of association, and of course the pluralism, kind of the existence of political parties. Instead of real political oppositions, there were kind of so-called pocket parties which were admitted to the parliament, and despite of that, there was never kind of division of powers in Uzbekistan. It still remained the same situation nowadays. But when the Shavkat Mirziyoyev actually succeeded in his power, he started changing to some extent status quo, making some steps toward kind of softening regime, and it did succeeded in kind of improving situation in terms of freedom of press, freedom of expression. The political prisoners were released from the prison. The number of also Muslim prisoners were also reduced, but still, for the moment, as far as I know, around 2,000 remain in prison. And we see here actually Vitaly Ponomarev, who documented the situation, especially with Muslim prisoners in Uzbekistan. So the situation very was extreme, and despite of this kind of restriction of kind of prisons, the regime was not able to maintain political stability, and the evidence of that is the situation in Andijan, and then the country was actually, the regime was totally isolated internationally. It was not accepted even by many of European countries. So which damaged its reputation and affected also such things actually, foreign investments, the status of Uzbekistan on international arena. Mirziyoyev had improved in this respect the situation. He made some steps toward opening. As I said, actually, a number of prisoners were relieved, and also the practice of forced labor, which was an important achievement, was not immediately, but over time it was ended. And for the moment, one case actually is the problem with state-orchestrated forced labor is almost kind of solved, despite, but also the situation, there are some still problems related to how the cotton industry is kind of managed by the government. I'm not going to provide details on this subject because a bit beyond the subject of our discussion. But despite all these improvements, the core of the political system remained unchanged. What I mean, actually, is still a personalistic regime with concentration of power in the hands of one person who is managing kind of governing the country thanks to his control over security agencies, law enforcement agencies, and based on his own clan and the patronage network. In terms of freedom of association and assembly, there was almost no progress in this respect. Still, there is problem to register civil society organizations. As an example, Agzam Turgunov is former political prisoner. He tried several times to register his own NGO, but was not successful. Not to say about the situation with regard to the political pluralism. There is still not any kind of political opposition in the country. If you look at the back, the kind of post-Soviet history, there were already probably three phases, three waves of how the actors, political figures in Uzbekistan tried to create and register their own political parties, opposition parties, of course. The first phase was when the Birlik party emerged. It was already on the kind of almost at the end of the Soviet Union and the beginning of independence. ERK party, and so they were not able to register. Briefly, ERK probably was allowed to operate. Even its leader was actually able to run for presidential elections. But after that, actually, Karimov started operations against him and his political party, and he was forced to escape from the country, both as well as the leaders of Birlik party. The second effort was when around 2004, 2005, Sanjar Omarov tried to create his own party, Sunshine Coalition, and also the Nigora Hidayatova, the home party, and it's also actually not successful. Regarding the Sanjar Omarov, he was himself imprisoned and tortured in prison. And only after that, actually, after years being in prison, he was released and he was forced again to escape from the country. And now the third wave, or third phase, we see kind of witnessing for the moment when at least one figure, one person, Hidinazar Lakulov, trying to register his own party, Freedom and Development, and also with the same outcome, actually. In 2021, he submitted his application for registering his own party. He managed to collect around 10,000 signatures in support of his application, but he was rejected because there was kind of still remain a number of barriers for creating and operating the political opposition parties in Uzbekistan. First of all, this is a kind of there is according to the law on political parties, there is an artificially very high threshold. One has to collect 20,000 signatures. At the same time, the question how the people who are collecting the signatures could do it if the organization committee also restricted in terms of this operation. It's only allowed to operate for 3 months only. How you can collect 20,000 during 3 months as organization committee? And if he managed to collect some certain number of signatures, then after that, actually, what happened with in his case, around 2,000, more than 2,000 signatures were recalled by the people, most likely under pressure of the authorities, which is quite kind of normal situation in Pakistan when the pressing upon the people not kind of to stay aside of the politics. And also there were some kind of provocations against Alakulov when he was trying to collect his signatures in Fergana Oblast, Fergana Dali. So all these kind of barriers, restrictions are not allowing practically to create such political party. But yeah, I guess even if he was able to collect 20,000 signatures, the outcome would be the same. He remains the only one person who tried to create the political parties who still remain in the country, which is to some extent the good news. He is not yet imprisoned, but not able to operate as a kind of as a political party. While others, people who tried in the past, now they're in exile. Some of them imprisoned, as I said, in the past, tortured. This is kind of what quite characteristic for this regime. It's how it's affecting situation in general in terms of political stability. But Lucie already mentioned the events in Kazakhstan when the people protested against the change of in the constitution, draft constitution, which would deprive the Kazakhstan of its constitutional status as an independent republic within Uzbekistan. The problem was not only the amendment itself. The problem is that it was there was no consultation with the society in Kazakhstan. This is kind of highlighting the situation when there is a gap in terms of dialogue and communication between the state, between the government and the people and the society. One of the reasons is actually, again, going back to the problem is the lack of freedom of association. There are no kind of organized civil society organization who would be kind of taking such a role as mediators between the society and the government, and actually being able also to press upon the government. When the government doesn't feel any pressure from society, represented by such civil society organizations and political parties, they fall into kind of full arbitrariness in abuse of power, and which is actually being followed by the political crisis. So this event in Kazakhstan was one of the 3 political crises the current regime already has experienced for the moment. The first one was when the government actually, because of the abuse of the government and the power, many people were kind of, their houses were demolished, they were evicted from their houses against their will, without proper adequate compensation. And so it caused discontent in the society and even some destabilization, especially on the western part of the country, when the people just uprised, actually they took to the street. So the government managed to resolve the situation by making some immediate kind of concession. The prime minister brought minivan with full of cash to Khwarezm region and distributed the cash as a form of compensation for the demolished houses. This was one political crisis. Even what happened in that year when there was attempt on the life of Deputy Hakim in the Kashkadaria region when he was trying to kind of also demolish the house of one of the local residents. The second crisis was Kazakhstan, as I said, which was due to the lack of civic freedoms, especially the freedom of assembly, lack of consultation, lack of dialogue with society. And the third was the situation with the energy collapse, which took place at the December of last year and beginning of this year. It was also quite characteristic about the status of governance in Uzbekistan. It actually doesn't, because the government doesn't feel any kind of the legitimate pressure presented by the kind of organized civil society. So, what kind of we have as outcome? All this crisis create some high risk of enforcing and kind of reinforcing repression. And what actually to some extent we already witnessed in Uzbekistan when already since 2019 around seven bloggers were already either imprisoned or kind of were some criminal cases created against them, and situation there's high risk that situation will progress further in this respect towards the status which will be akin to the previous regime of Islam Karimov. There is such a very important, very legitimate risk that it could happen. And so that's there is a temptation by the government to respond to this political crisis by not by kind of reforming the political system, but just reinforcing its control of the power and kind of reinforcing repressive measures against society and civil society organization, which should create a kind of the phenomenon of vicious circle. What we now witnessing is actually kind of some trends towards going to the previous status of affairs, but hopefully it will not happen if the international community to some extent make kind of take a role to exert some pressure upon Uzbekistan, not to let them to kind of to decline to the worst state of affairs. So if you kind of speak about what would be kind of recommendations, to be realistic, probably unlikely that we can expect that the regime would kind of change the whole political system in the observable future and allow the political parties to emerge and run for general elections. But what is possible and quite realistic is something akin to what taking place in United Kingdom, where there is a kind of option you creating your political parties for running for general elections, and also there is option for running for so-called minor elections, only for to attend the elections for local councils. And there was already some efforts to promote this kind of agenda by Pulat Ahunov. He is one of the leaders of Belik party. He residing in Sweden. He tried kind of to promote this idea, convince the political regime in Uzbekistan to allow to register real opposition parties and to run for such election on the local level, not on the central, but local. But his initiative was rejected totally. So something actually we should probably to think about whether it makes sense to again to re-engage with the current regime and offer them to consider such option to at least to allow the running for such free election on the local level, on the level of the local councils, which we should not jeopardize the control of the power by the current regime on the central level, but at least with some could be some improvements on the local level.
Good afternoon. My name is Serik Beyssembayev. I represent PaperLab Research Center, independent think tank based in Astana. I would also talk about the issue of political pluralism in the context of Kazakhstan. Yes, next slide, please. And let me start with the context. Kazakhstan witnessed a very huge social and cultural transformation over the past 30 years, and we now have a more pluralistic society than it was before. And in 2019, when first President Nazarbayev left and opened the door for political change, we identified, according to our research, that expectations of political change was growing, and it led to the public expectations for political transformation and liberalization. But after the 2 years of Tokayev's power, disillusionment happened, especially in the context of President Tokayev's reform. And the tragic events of January served as a manifestation of this accumulated public dissatisfaction. Tokayev's promises to liberalize the political system was an attempt to overcome the crisis and legitimize his power. And as you know, he announced his package of political reforms after the January events. Next slide, please. And what was the state's narrative after the January events? Tokayev promised that he will redistribute power and will enhance the role of parliament. Also, there was promise on building more pluralistic parliament system, and after the election we had two new political parties, and also election of mayors of districts and small cities was introduced, but despite these amendments, we still have a situation with a very low level of political pluralism. So we still have an over-centralized presidential system, which still unchanged, and there is no checks and balance system. In 2022, we had a presidential election with pre-arranged candidates, and we had no genuine alternatives. And in 2023, we had parliamentary elections to political parties, which I mentioned. They were, again, two puppet parties created as a facade for pluralism. Manipulation of election results with only loyal and compliant individuals who are taking office. So there is no chance to register a political party with alternative agenda. And in 2023, this year, prior to parliament elections, next slide please, we conducted opinion survey. Here you can see the results. We asked people, do they feel that their interests are represented by participating political parties and the candidates? And according to results, a majority of respondents said that no, they don't feel that their interests are represented by political parties and candidates. Also we asked, next slide please. We asked if you go to the election, which party would you like to vote for? So here you can see the distribution of results of opinion survey and official results. So yellow marked our opinion survey, and blue is the official results. And you can see that a majority of respondents had no idea which party would they like to vote, and it was prior to parliament election, before two weeks of parliament election, and this is a very, I think, a good illustration of representation gap which we have. So people have a very high willingness of participation in political process. So we asked about their desire to vote, and it's about 60% of people who declared the willingness to go and to vote. but a majority of them didn't know which party would like they vote. Next slide, please. So what we have in this current situation, overall, we have still unfulfilled political participation and the existing representation gap, which leads to increased dissatisfaction and the social tension. As well, alienation of citizens from political life continues. We have a high level of distrust in government initiatives and disappointment with Tokayev's reforms. Another very important factor is the lack of fair investigation of January events, which is a factor of escalating existing grievances and is still a focal point for mobilizing protest movements in Kazakhstan. As my colleagues mentioned, repressions against civil society is ongoing, and this potentially serves as a catalyst for future unrest, and it undermines the stability of the country. And now we live in a situation of expecting new trigger for another protest mobilization. It's a general overview. I will be happy to answer a question and provide my recommendation. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you to the speakers for excellent presentations. So we will have time for some questions, which is great news. But actually, Serik, I wanted to give you and others an opportunity now to share recommendations if you want. I know Alisher and Lucie had already mentioned a couple, so if there's more that you'd like to share, and then Serik as well, please do that now if you'd like.
To be honest, it's a very small opportunities to improve political pluralism in Kazakhstan, and as a representative of civil society, my hope related to the activists and the new wave of political movements. And I think that only supporting these civil society institutions, organizations, and individuals, we can provide more opportunity for democratization. As well, and it's very important to help our civil society to be more sustainable in terms of resources, in terms of overall support. And especially it needed more support for organizations who provide observation during the elections. Also, it's very important to work with growing, to help our youth movements in terms of providing them more information. What is a democracy? How liberalism, liberal democracy can be helpful in our context, because as in most post-Soviet countries, the term of liberalism and democracy is marginalized and demonized from, especially due to Russian propaganda, and it's very important to work at a grassroots level and to help our people to become more informed and to help them build collaborations with each other and with civil society institutions. Thank you.
I talked about the major elections on the local level, but also I didn't mention a very important aspect of the current situation in the country is a lack of real division of labor, and I mentioned that the pocket parties and the pocket parliament. But also the important to stress is the lack of rule of law. In this sphere, we don't see kind of any significant or tangible progress. This is exactly the point when the political regime in Uzbekistan could make some concessions or kind of go for some compromises, because that would not undermine the kind of the core of political system. And we have already some examples around the world when there were some kind of authoritarian regimes, at the same time having kind of relatively strong rule of law. No, for instance, the Emirates, they have good kind of ratings in terms of the anti-corruption and also kind of rule of law. And at the same time, as we know, kind of is not democratic country. So this is something actually the international community, OSCE, and other international organizations actually who should pay attention to, and also to make there is certain leverage here actually which could be employed is the foreign investments, because the political regime of Uzbekistan is very much eager to attract foreign investments in order to boost economic development and to raise its own political legitimacy. And so I think it should be some kind of conditional, this conditionality should be embedded onto this relationship between the Western countries, the United States, European Union, using such mechanisms as a kind of the foreign investments, and all there is such a kind of instrument as GSP Plus, adopted by European Union, which is actually, but its own legal status should be allocated to the countries like Uzbekistan, which is accessing the tariff-free access to the markets in Europe, if the country doesn't violate significantly human rights. So it should be also kind of complemented with a reference to this status with the rule of law, and to make kind of more persistent in kind of using these instruments to encourage Uzbekistan to adopt make some steps, meaningful steps towards establishing the rule of law, which has to do very much has to do with the situation in human rights, by the way. So this is my kind of suggestions actually to consider and maybe discuss.
Thank you. So we have opportunity to answer questions. If you have a question, please stand up or raise your hand. You need to speak in a microphone in order for the interpretation to work. So my colleague will hand you the microphone if you'd like to ask a question. So are there any questions right now?
Thank you. Just a quick question. I mean, I was wondering with the war in Ukraine if you are worried about a potential decrease of Western support to democracy, to civil society in Central Asia, taking into account, the possible prioritization of some geopolitical or economic interest to push Central Asian countries to distance themselves from Russia. I'm taking a concrete example here. You saw that President Biden met in New York the 5 Central Asian countries' leaders. It was very moderate in terms of pushing on human rights. So my question is, are you worried about that?
Thank you for the question. I think, as you mentioned, we've seen an increase in engagement from European states, the US, an increase in engagement on Central Asia due to this attention and the war in Ukraine, because we've seen China, Russia start paying more attention as well to Central Asia. So European states, the US have also responded. Was that right?
Engagement in democracy?
No, exactly.
Okay.
No. But
exactly.
But as much as this can be in risk that democracy and human rights will be relayed back to a secondary level, it could also be seen as an opportunity, and this is why we push IPHR partners, other organizations from the region, and we push for it to be an opportunity, not also. Okay, we see engagement, we see increase in negotiations, but this should also be where human rights are put at the center of these discussions. So in terms, there is a risk that these concerns are being pushed back, but actually for the international community, this is the opportunity to keep raising these cases, keep even as small violations as they may be, to keep them at the forefront of negotiations in all aspects of economic negotiations. And so I'm sure.
Yes, indeed. Now, given kind of current new geopolitical situation and especially the war in Ukraine, of course, it's affecting the situation in terms of kind of how the West is actually going, what the West is going to do to kind of to address issues of human rights, democracy, and rule of law in our countries. So there is certain kind of understanding, consideration that if they push too hard upon our countries, then actually they can fall under kind of more influence of Russia and China. There is such legitimate concern, but at the same time, if you kind of let this regime to decline from the worst kind of status of affairs, then unlikely you can consider them as reliable kind of partners to the West. So I was pleased to hear that at least the last C5+1 summit in New York, and also was replicated to some extent in Germany. It was similar kind of summit with similar kind of accent on the rule of law. This is good news that actually at least the United States and Germany, which is probably representing the whole European Union, going to make some kind of point on this promoting the rule of law in our countries, but it should not remain as a declarative statement. We should kind of make some meaningful step how to do it actually. So we can avoid, of course you need to kind of engage with these countries, with the regimes, but without kind of some pressure, some conditionality embedded into kind of cooperation and the investment in our regime, the result unlikely to be achieved.
And, I would consider this war in Ukraine from sociological perspective, because it's a very important factor of shifting public opinion in Kazakhstan. So, for example, we now identified that perception of Russia has been changing. So we have much more people who consider Russia as a threat. It was before. So the last year, so we see that more than 25% of Kazakhstanis they think that its aggression from Russia is something very possible. So it means that Russian influence for Kazakhstan is decreasing, and it's a chance for new developments, new and reshaping our socio-political landscape. And more people who consider, for example, other vectors, other countries as example for future development and so on.
Thank you. So we have one question in the back, I believe, and then and this gentleman over here.
I'll be quick. Hi everybody, my name is John Michael Kristal. I'm the Norwegian ambassador to all the 5 states in Central Asia. Thank you very much for your presentations, interesting. I have one very quick question. We have observed over the last, say, couple of years, 2-3 years, that there has been a lot of more meetings at political level inside the region between the 5 states, both at governmental level, even at presidential level. That was not the case in the past at all. So I'd like to hear your comments on that. What kind of domestic effects do you think will come out of that? Do you look at that as something positive, or are you worried?
Do you mean the meetings between the leaders of Central Asian countries, or?
Yes, not with the other formats, just the 5.
I think it's good news that the countries in the region trying to act together more and more. This is something actually should be kind of very much encouraged, because all these countries are so small in terms of their significance on the global level. So only united they could be kind of attract attention to our region. So that's why this summit actually, I think, is actually developed in the right direction, and it's a kind of something going beyond the subject of our discussion. But this meeting should be not kind of limited just by kind of speaking to each other, but also the kind of taking such steps to solve the some problems between the countries, especially the Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. As you know, the still kind of situation on the border has not been relieved. So and also kind of no kind of so far meaningful kind of developments towards economic integration on the level. So we are in the past efforts to create such kind of to integrate on regional level, but unfortunately the probably interference from Russia, from Moscow didn't allow to develop to this direction. Hopefully now the situation is actually may change, but it still remains to see. But the problem is that the countries, if they reach some certain agreements, they should respect these agreements. This is again, once again, the rule of law, right? If you don't respect kind of not following the rule of law on national level, how are you going to kind of respect the law in agreements on the regional level? This is something, issues related to each other, I think.
Thank you. This gentleman here, please, your question.
Yes, my name is Igor Cutler. I'm from the United States and representing a museum and a university, New Jersey Commission for Cost Education, and civil society organization. This is my question. Serik, first of all, thank you very much for your outstanding presentations. It was great. And Serik, initiated this question for everyone. You mentioned that you need help. Yes. Okay. Assistance. I understand about the governments. Can you specify something? What kind of assistance possible, not jeopardize anyone in your countries, okay, from the West? So academia, education institutions, maybe museums, non-profit organizations, from NGOs, because it should be in concrete terms. Okay, what you need, what we can do.
So, as I represent think tanks, so I can start with supporting local research organizations. So, for example, we are only one organization who conduct opinion survey on war in Ukraine, parliamentary election, and the January events. And we actually had no financial support. We just partnered with our another NGO based in Almaty, MediaNet, and we conducted a survey. But it was very demanded, and a lot of media outlets who disseminated our results. So I mean that there is no institutional support for NGOs who do research, who do opinion survey. Another support needed for our organizations who provide political observation, as I mentioned. For example, Ilkhamov, Roman Remer, he's representing this organization. They they did observation as a volunteers last time because there was no much support. Also, it's important to voice the issue of January events and to call for the international investigation of this event, because it's a huge trauma of our society. According to our opinion survey, 54% of Kazakhstanis, they don't trust the results of official investigation. It means that the question, what's happened, is still open. And we need more collaboration and more work on from the civil society to investigate, to research, to publish materials, reports on this very important topic, and international organizations can be very helpful in terms of supporting this.
This gentleman here, and then...
My name is Alisher, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Uzbekistan. If allow you may, I will speak in Russian in order to be more clear. У меня есть несколько комментариев по выступлению. Было очень интересно послушать наших спикеров, то есть оценки со стороны региона, стран в отдельности. По первому выступлению, они очень так емко прошли по всем вопросам. То, что трагические события в Каракалпакстане были отмечены, Но это не было там мирных демонстраций, то есть там были погибшие со стороны правоохранительных органов и со стороны протестующих, то есть было использовано насилие, и это мы не можем никак отрицать. И в этом смысле то, что правительство и на самом высоком уровне сразу же приехало на место событий, и самое главное, были услышаны доводы протестующих, то есть по этим всем статьям они остались неизменными, не были, то есть они внесены в референдум. Это значит, что мы не можем сказать, что со стороны правительства какие-либо доводы игнорировались. Более того, после этих трагических событий была создана независимая комиссия, внутри ее во главе с омбудсменом, но в нее вошли НПО и лидеры общественного мнения из Каракалпакстана тоже. И сегодня большинство из заключенных после этих событий, они уже отпущены. Большинство из них, и остались те, кто действительно в этих событиях призывал к антиконституционным, то есть действиям. И в этом вопросе то, что главное, считаю, что причины этих событий, вы знаете, что Каракалпакстан — это регион, где это экологическое бедствие, то есть очень депрессивный регион был в экономическом отношении. Вот за последние годы господин Алишер Илкhamov в самом начале отметил, что Узбекистан действительно изменился. То, что сейчас Узбекистан — это есть прогресс во всех сферах, в том числе в Каракалпакстане. Оттуда люди уходили, а за последние 5 лет выросло население там на 7,3%. Там уже живет почти 2 миллиона. До 2015-2016 года там проживало 1 600-500 человек. В чем причина возвращения людей? В августе этого года было принято постановление правительства, где огромные налоговые льготы даются предпринимателям, населению, например, на 50% снижены налоги предпринимателям, земельные налоги снижены. То есть главная цель, понимаем, что причиной является, сегодня на пленарной сессии представитель парламента Казахстана тоже правильно отмечал, экономическое положение людей напрямую связано с обеспечением прав человека. То есть не выводя людей из бедности, не выводя людей из тяжелого положения, мы не можем эффективно обеспечивать права человека. И в этом плане...
Ваш вопрос, пожалуйста. Ваш вопрос.
У меня комментарий, комментировать. И последнее. Сейчас отметили последние процессы в самом регионе Центральной Азии. Мы, будучи внутри, видя и считаем, что Узбекистан был одним из главных двигателей этих процессов открытости между странами. Последняя новость. Мы с Казахстаном проходим границу нашими, то есть ID-картами гражданскими. За последний период там тысячи людей, то есть у нас не то что визовый режим, который был раньше, Кыргызстан, у нас уже люди проходят границу уже обычными паспортами. То есть это показатель, что регион сплачивается, есть огромный процесс. И самое главное, что международное сообщество уже сегодня более чем 14 форматов Центральной Азии плюс, то есть США есть, ЕС, Германия недавно, то есть международное сообщество тоже не безразлично и поддерживает эти процессы. Спасибо.
Thank you. And so we have one more question, and then maybe give the panel an opportunity to respond to the last 2 questions and any final words.
Vitaly would respond some of these
Please,
comments.
Vitaly.
Короткий вопрос тоже связанный с Каракалпакстаном. В связи с Каракалпакским кризисом среди части каракалпакских активистов выдвигается предложение о необходимости создания зарегистрированных политических партий на уровне Каракалпакстана, потому что они считают, что та партийная система, которая есть, она неадекватно отражает ваше отношение к этому лозунгу, к этому предложению. И, конечно, буквально одно слово, не могу не сказать, что не было ни одного погибшего сотрудника правоохранительных органов во время событий в Нукусе. Были такие заявления в СМИ, но они не подтвердились. И в трех приговорах по этому делу, которые выносились в Бухаре, этот факт зафиксирован. Там есть списки раненых, погибших. Нет ни одного сотрудника правоохранительных органов Узбекистана, погибших в ходе событий в Нукусе, вопреки тому, что сейчас было сказано. Спасибо.
Thank you very much for the wonderful questions, and give the panelists an opportunity to respond to the last two, and please, any final words you have. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
Responding to the question by Vitaly, yes, of course, it would be good idea actually if the authorities would allow to create not pocket kind of party, but real opposition parties initiated by the people themselves. Of course, it's actually very much relevant to what I was talking about, allowing the at least some opposition, some political competition on the local level, which would make good positive effect on the accountability of the authorities, at least on the local level. Regarding this kind of comments, thank you for your comments about the situation in Kazakhstan. I would, yes, agree that Shavkat Mirziyoyev quickly responded and he recalled this initiative to change the constitution with regard to the status of Kazakhstan, which was a good step. But at the same time, actually, he probably gave the green light to the law enforcement to kind of use the power against the protesters. There were little evidence that were real kind of violence from the protesters. It was largely peaceful protests. And for instance, the Tajimuratov, who was the informal leader, there was no evidence of his kind of violating any law. So the very kind of trial which was held against the first time 29 people who were sentenced to different convicted to different terms, largely was a violation. It was kind of a regress from the past towards rule of law. This was kind of regretful. The good news that was the trial itself was well reported. It was during the trial, the press had access to the courtroom. There was a separate room where they could listen to all the presentations. We heard what Tajimuratov was saying. This was something not what take place during the Karimov regime. This is what, in this respect, there is sort of step forward. But the trial itself, okay, I mean the indictments and the verdict, I think were unfair and not contradicting the local law and also international standards of international law in terms of human rights and so on. So this is something to work on and actually to make meaningful concessions towards society by kind of reconsidering, especially the fate of Mr. Tajimuratov. There are some reports that he being tortured, so there should be kind of more transparency about his fate, about his status in prison. That would be, I think it will be kind of very much greeted by the civil society, by international community. This would be my proposal to the Uzbek authorities.
Скажу на русском, в заключение, почему важно рассматривать политический плюрализм через запрос общества, потому что именно это позволяет стабилизировать наши системы. То есть я говорю не только про Казахстан, но и Узбекистан и другие страны Центральной Азии. То есть уже очевидно, что сложился определенный цикл. Рост запроса на политические изменения, повышение уровня репрессий со стороны государства в ответ на это, потом насилие, и в ответ на насилие еще больше усиление давления, и временное подавление активности, гражданской активности и протестной активности, но по стечению времени накопление напряжения и очередной социальный взрыв. То есть мы, страны Центральной Азии, у нас замкнутый круг получается, и проходим вновь и вновь, и пока не извлечены нужные уроки. У нас в Казахстане было ожидание, что после январских событий, наконец-то, Токаев и его администрация поняли, что нужно открывать политическую систему, давать возможность для разных акторов конкурировать в открытом поле, создавать свои партии, заниматься гражданским активизмом, открыто высказываться. И это ожидание было не только потому, что мы гражданское общество, но и потому, что в сторону Токаева был такой месседж, что формула сначала экономика, потом политика, она была неверной. Мы пересматриваем эту формулу, начинаем с политики. И это, конечно же, создало определенную основу для его поддержки, было очень довольно большие ожидания в обществе. Вот прошло почти 2 года, я вижу, что произошел такой спад и довольно большое разочарование в обществе по поводу обещаний Токаева. И, к сожалению, мы видим, что нарастает новая волна напряжения, растет недовольство тем, что делает правительство и так далее. И, к сожалению, мы заходим в новый круг эскалации этих противоречий. И как бы наша задача как исследователей не критиковать правительство Токаева, а просто показать, как это все работает. Все это кажется очень очевидным, понятным, но почему-то понятно, что у нас контекст, геополитический контекст и так далее, соседи не те, но просто хотелось бы сказать, что на самом деле ситуацию в стране больше определяет внутренние факторы, чем внешние. И я здесь часто спорю с представителями Акарды и чиновниками о том, что нужно все-таки смотреть на то, что происходит внутри, и исходить из запросов своих граждан, а не все время жить в страхе, либо в ожидании, что скажут большие крупные державы вокруг нас. То есть у меня, честно говоря, довольно негативное ожидание по поводу того, что в Казахстане происходит, хотя я стараюсь быть оптимистом, мы с коллегами обмениваемся мнением, и пока что возможности для улучшения мы не видим. Единственное, возможно, война в Украине станет некоторым поворотным моментом, но опять же здесь очень слишком много неопределенностей. Не хотел бы заканчивать свою речь на такой пессимистичной ноте, но я рад, что сегодня нахожусь здесь, и I'm very thankful for Freedom Now for organizing this event and for all those who came today. Thank you so much.
Great. No, we're awesome. Thank you very much. We've taken more of your time already. I appreciate you coming, and thanks again to the panelists for excellent presentations. Have a nice evening, everyone.